Good afternoon, and welcome to today's McGill Alumni Webcast, the third in our four-part series in partnership with the McGill Sustainability Systems Initiative, looking at the environmental, social, and economic challenges facing our planet, and the role that McGill researchers, students, and administrators are playing to help us understand the issues and develop more sustainable approaches and practices. My name is Derek Kassoff, Managing Director of Communications at McGill's Office of University Advancement, and it's Thursday, October 1st. If you've had a chance to tune into either of the previous two webcasts in this series, you would have already met some of McGill's top researchers and thought leaders in the areas of ecology, the environment, and sustainability. Today, we have the pleasure of meeting two more members of McGill's powerhouse research team. One who spends much of his time in the backwoods of rural China to chart and understand how villagers organize and self-regulate their harvests. The other spends most of her time working on an idea that has tantalized chemists for years. Can we transform materials readily available in nature into a viable alternative to plastic? Two very different approaches to confronting some of the gravest threats to our environment, and yet the perfect framework as we seek to understand the many challenges and obstacles that confront researchers working to develop the solutions and best practices we need to put us on the road to a more sustainable planet. So without further ado, let's meet today's panel. We have with us Brian Robinson, who's an associate professor in McGill's Department of Geography, a research affiliate at the Chinese Center for Eco-Environmental Science, and co-lead of the McGill Sustainability System Initiative's landscape theme. And Audrey Moores is an associate professor in the Department of Chemistry, a former Canada Research Chair in Green Chemistry, and co-lead of the McGill Sustainability Systems Initiative's materials theme. Well, welcome to both of you, and thank you for taking time out to join us today for what I think will be a fascinating discussion about each of your research projects, as well as the challenges and opportunities facing your work and that of your colleagues. Before we get started, a reminder that if you're watching live and have questions for our panelists, you can send them in via email to aoc@mcgill.ca, and we'll do our best to address them to our guests today. So let's start by understanding a bit about each of your work and areas of focus here at McGill. Professor Robinson, maybe the best way to introduce your research is to read the very first line of your McGill biography, which says, "I look at how people meet their needs through the use of ecosystems and resources and the role this plays in development in poor regions of the world." You also go on to write that your interest in this area was first piqued after you graduated from college, joined the US Peace Corps, and moved to China. So I'm really intrigued now. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work, your ongoing connections to China, and what sustainability questions your research is hoping to answer?
Sure. Thanks, Derek, and thanks for the nice introduction. And as everyone can see, I'm in my basement here, hunkered down. So excuse the unfinishedness of the background, but it's a good, quiet place to have good conversations. So, yeah, I started off and I lived in Southwest China, so more rural. I lived actually in a city, but in the lesser developed side of China. Right after I finished my bachelor's degree from 2000 to 2002, I was in the city of Chengdu, which in Chinese standards is kind of a medium-sized Chinese city, but still has about 8 million people in it. But one of the things that really captured my attention when I lived there was just the pace of change and development that was happening. And some of this was was making dramatic improvements in quality of life. Really interested in very generally how we take actions to try to improve our quality of life. And these are more, sort of the standard questions around international development. But then, given my previous background and where I was really curious about how this also played into how the environment relates to these questions about improving quality of life, and sort of this intersection of international development and what we need to do to either protect or utilize environmental resources to help improve that quality of life. So it's really that tension between protecting and utilizing that I came to find really fascinating. And so now I generally look at how communities relate to their local environments. I'm motivated to better understand how or whether the ways that we live and work are underpinned by environmental resources. And usually this takes shape in either evaluating policies that are being enacted to either limit or protect environmental resources, and maybe they come with some sort of compensation or payment to households that are subject to restrictions, right? So I evaluate the impacts of those policies. or I look at the micro scale, at the household level, on how people utilize environmental resources and think about the value that that plays to their livelihoods and their ability to just get by.
So I know when we spoke earlier, you mentioned specifically examples like following Chinese villagers into the backwoods and seeing how they collect and harvest mushrooms and how they're self-regulating sort of a mushroom harvest amongst themselves, presumably amicably, and in a way that will keep the resource of mushrooms consistent from year to year. I was wondering in that context, how this research might be relevant for us in a Western context. My first thought was, East Coast fisheries here in Canada,
Yeah.
where government regulations are needed to protect against overfishing, to ensure a robust bounty of fish every year, but also a steady supply of fish stocks for the long term. So I guess you're constantly making those connections between what's happening in your observations and studies in China with real world issues facing us here in North America, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, the mushroom study was a big project where I looked at how villagers decide, well, these all these mushrooms in our forest, but if we all just go out and pick them, then it actually causes us to pick them too early and we don't get good prices for them, or they're not as big as they could be to just fill bellies, right? And so let's try to restrict ourselves a little bit and create rules around management so that we can wait for mushrooms to grow a little bigger, and then we actually get a lot more money for them when they're a lot bigger. And so looking at how communities try to decide and develop these kinds of rules. And that's sort of, it was a micro scale example, but it's analogous to lots of the big picture environmental questions that we face today, right? How do we self-regulate ourselves to manage climate change? How do we protect carbon stocks? How do we protect fisheries on the east coast of Canada? So these questions relate and translate. And I've actually just started a big project where I'm using some of these same ideas and methods in Canada as well. That'll be a project that'll last over the next maybe 10 years if we're lucky to get an extension. But yeah, these issues translate across many contexts and sort of levels of development.
Great, thank you. And I'm sure you'll have a lot more to say to some of the broader questions around research challenges and obstacles when we get to it shortly. But Professor Moores, now that we kind of briefly touched on the subject of seafood, this seems like the perfect moment to ask you about your research. Maybe I'll stop there and let you share with us what products from the natural world you think might wind up becoming a viable alternate to plastics.
Yeah, so thanks a lot, Derek, for the opportunity to speak a little bit about what we do, and especially in the context of sustainability research. I think this is really awesome. So yeah, we've been playing a little bit with crustaceans lately in my research lab, and that's been really fun. What my group is doing in general is looking at chemical processes that are greener and better, and ensure that we protect our environment and our health as we interact with these processes or with the chemicals resulting from it. And there's been indeed a very big question that you laid out in your very kind introduction, Derek, which was, how can we take molecules that are out there already, like that nature made very patiently and very, with a specific craft, how do we take that those materials, and turn them into things that are useful for us? And there's been a huge amount of work, in particular in the last 20 years, to really try to develop strategies to take biomass and turn it into interesting molecules for us. And some of the interesting molecules we have around us are plastics. The plastics that we have around us, they've become this kind of horrendous material that people are sometimes trying to kick out of our lives. But they also serve very, very important purposes with for instance, in the context of health, where they have unique properties that make them very suitable for making catheters or things that we use a lot. And on the other side, the fact that we have lots of plastics in cars, for instance, allow us to have lighter cars and then spend less energy to travel around. So there's lots of benefits in using plastics. The question is, what do we do at the end of their lives? So people have started to think, okay, let's make bioplastics, let's make plastics that are going to degrade in the environment. But turns out that not all of the ones that have been developed are actually that degradable, and it created this huge problem where we have a lot of plastics in the environment that does not degrade and stick around. So with these two questions in mind, how do we use biomass from nature and how do we protect nature from afterlife questions? We started to explore the ability to transform molecules that are there and do it further better, with greener processes, but also trying to make material that at the end of the day is not going to be damaging to the environment. So I don't know if you are like me, Derek, but I absolutely love lobster. And if you eat lobster, you're gonna have this material that has this, you have to break the shell, and the shell is really interesting materials. They're tough, but also pliable, and you can see how we could use these materials in order to make cool materials. So I don't know if Stuart, you can put up the first slide maybe that I had for you guys. And on this slide, what you can see is that if you think about the shell of a crustacea, it's actually a complex material composed of 3 different materials. I made this slide without any chemical, guys, so that you're not too scared. It's just like pictures. But the idea is that you have these 3 materials that are intertwined together. And the challenge is to take them apart and release a material called chitin, which is a polymer that is super interesting, and it is a plastic in itself. And then the next challenge is to transform this plastic into another one called chitosan, which is really interesting because it has bio applications. So you can make sutures, you can make filters to clean water, you can do a lot of stuff with that chitosan. But the problem is, between chitin and chitosan, you need to use a lot of chemistry to do this transformation. To the point that in Canada, they had to shut down some of the plants that were doing that because it was releasing too much dirty water. So what my group did is transform this process. You can go without any solvent. So we do everything dry, like you mix powders together. And this enables to have less energy usage, less chemical usage, and less water usage. So now we're talking to people on the East Coast to try to develop these processes there. And in particular, you can go to the third slide, Stuart. In particular, we have a project right now with Parks Canada, and in particular, Kijimkuji Park in Nova Scotia, where they are taking lots of crabs from the environment because these are bad crabs. They are damaging the local environment and ecosystems. And we're looking into using that resource in order to make some bioplastics based on our process.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you for that wonderful explanation. Graphs would be a pretty close second. So I'd be very happy to continue to support the environment through my continual appetite for lobster and crabs and other seafood. So I'm happy to do my part as well. So that's great. I do have a bunch more questions, but just again, a reminder, if anyone watching live now does have any questions about any of the research that they've just heard about or other related questions, please feel free to email us right away at aoc@mcgill.ca. So I would imagine that in complex research such as this, 2 of the more important aspects would be the need to work across cultures and across disciplines. And I can't imagine that either of these is particularly easy. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of these challenges you might face. Professor Robinson, maybe I'll start with you. Can you tell us what it's like working in foreign places, foreign environments, such as China, where in addition to language barriers, I imagine there must be large cultural gaps to negotiate. What have your experiences been like, and how do you manage to navigate some of these obstacles?
Yeah, so I mean, the first and most immediate and obvious things are around just simple language and communication, and so obviously it helps to be able to communicate a bit. But I think my I've been working and living in China since for the past 20 years or so, and since taught me that it really does go quite far beyond just language to really know how to be effective. Sometimes it doesn't even require language to know how to be effective, but it requires a sense, sort of a cultural fluency, right? And these are challenges that I have in lots of the other places that I work that are not my own culture, but especially if you're hoping for your science and your research to break through the ivory tower and actually affect policy or some sort of programmatic dialogue in these other countries. So in China, for example, I mean, I'm sure many of the listeners out there have visited China, and there are frustrations that happen just as you're traveling and trying to work in China. It's easy to hit roadblocks, and it's easy to hit roadblocks anywhere, right? But in China, it's really frustrating when you have you want to get permission to go somewhere to collect some data or use equipment, whatever. You think somebody has said yes, but they haven't really, or the wrong person has said yes, and you show up to do the thing you want to do, and it turns out somebody's like, you can't do that. Right. So these things happen, and you have to be flexible in understanding how and why they can happen. But and in rural China, sometimes just taking the right person out for a nice dinner helps, right? These are like just the ways that you develop relationships and build trust and have those kinds of informal conversations that let people understand what you're doing and your motivations and the kind of person you are, that aren't about the research or formal approvals or filling out the right form. So some of those things really help a lot, but you need to know kind of how to do them, and you need to have the right partners to help instruct you and guide you in the right directions to do these things correctly too. And sometimes it's, like I said, not just, not asking this person, but that other person, it's like not this person, but that person's boss. Or sometimes you don't go to the boss, you go to the person below because they can get you in the door. But, so it's just knowing how to navigate these situations. I think sometimes that is, really helpful, or at least helpful in being sort of efficient about getting things done. But part of it's just about being persistent too. You just have to get in there and want to see things through. And sometimes it takes a few stops and starts, but you keep going, and you find either a way through, or maybe a way around, or maybe you have to change your plans a bit. All that happens.
Great. Interesting. So Professor Moores, when we spoke earlier, you suggested to me that much of your time and energy is actually spent outside of your laboratory, collaborating with professors and researchers at McGill and beyond in areas such as business, economics, law. I think you even mentioned philosophy. Why is this cross-sectional collaboration so important to your work? And can the translation of knowledge and ideas across these fields sometimes feel as if you're translating maybe between English and Chinese?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I very early on in my career realized that being a chemist is an incredibly powerful, power that we have, because we can change the world and everything around us is chemicals. But at the same time, it comes with responsibilities. And there was a movement started about 25 years ago called green chemistry, and it was this idea that we chemists, we can actually choose to research how to make chemistry better for, again, the environment and our health. So I was really impressed by that, and very early on started to hang out with people like this and participated in various organizations around green chemistry. And very rapidly it became evident that if we wanted to have an impact, we needed to reach out beyond chemistry. We needed to start to talk to engineers. We needed to start to talk to philosophers, to lawmakers, to companies, to then have an idea of what business is like and how management works. And very rapidly you sketch, and then there's arts and biology, toxicology. I mean, I can go on forever. Literally every aspect of science somehow can contribute to making more sustainable science. So I think that in the recent, I would say in the last 5 years, there's been a big change in the way research is funded, and you could really feel from governments this desire to fund broader arrays of projects that would be broader, encompassing more different disciplines and trying to encourage people to work together. And I think it really came at a right moment in my career where I could also start to venture outside of my comfort zone myself. So I started to invite colleagues to my green chemistry teaching, for instance, have people from law or from management or from toxicology come in and chat. And one thing leaded to the next. We started as well collaborating, and this has been a game changer, honestly, because it's the difference between working in your lab and doing the same kind of thing, which you can publish. Sure, it's cool, but then there's no real hope that it will ever get out, versus trying to work on a real problem and try to make a difference. And I think this has been incredible for me, but incredible for my students as well. They've learned so much interfacing with these kinds of people.
Great. And I guess maybe I'll turn the next question to you, Professor Robinson. I guess this is really what the McGill Sustainability Systems Initiative is all about. I mean, it's really about trying to build this umbrella of researchers from various disciplines, both campuses at McGill, sort of getting them to collaborate more, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the McGill Sustainability Systems Initiative is really novel among programs that I know of in universities. The idea that you dedicate a set level of funding to trying to get people within the university to work across those disciplinary silos it's not a common type of program at all, especially for the level that McGill is committed to it in terms of the funding levels. So, I mean, the whole idea was to not force, but take areas where people would naturally find their research interests overlapping, and put them together so that those connections could be made, and in ways that wouldn't typically or naturally happen if we just sort of kept within the walls of our own department, and applied to the same funding agencies. Right. The idea was to try to get you out of your comfort zone a little bit, force interactions to some degree, but only to the point that it opens up these natural communications between disciplines that should exist. They have to exist for us to develop holistic solutions, right? But we don't have those typical channels to communicate like that. They're not naturally set up in the way the university works, and so the MSSI is enacting that kind of vision.
Great, great. Thanks for that. So you mentioned, both of you, a little bit the notion of funding, and I feel like we can't really have a full conversation about the question of why is sustainability research so challenging without touching more specifically on the issue of funding. And I know it comes in different levels and from different areas. Maybe I'll turn back to you, Professor Moores. Maybe if you could just talk initially about basic research funding. I imagine that here in Canada, governments are eager to support research around sustainability and climate change and environmental issues in general. So does this suggest that it's relatively easy for you and your colleagues, at least at the basic research level, to get funding from government agencies?
Yeah, yes and no. So I think that the traditional way that research is funded is that we have a great program in Canada that many colleagues envy us around the world, called Discovery Grant, which is this thing funded by NSERC, which is the funding agency for science and engineering. And what you do is every 5 years you write your NSERC discovery, and what it does is it funds your basic research to actually make very important discoveries in your field of science. And this is essential because we need to keep being really robust, innovative, and globally performing scientists in our field. But for many years, it was actually difficult to actually match this with funding that would be dedicated to sustainability research, and in particular research, again, requiring many different people around the room and people from different topics. So what I think that we are at a turning point now, that there is more and more of these kinds of funding that are putting in place, but it is very difficult to apply for those, because if you do not have those connections existing, and if you don't have this way of thinking about how you talk to people in a different discipline, and if you are not actually, if you don't know how to do this from having gone through this, it's actually quite challenging to do. So I think what MSSI has done in a way that was quite visionary is to actually position McGill extremely well strategically to go out and grab some of these new initiatives that are emerging now. And you're right that Canada now is investing money and in that, and there are some opportunities emerging for this, but these are really large grants, really big applications that require to have people with a very good vision and working together for the last 3 years at MSSI with Brian and many other people has been instrumental in our ability to actually cast this vision to the future.
Mm-hmm. Now, Professor Robinson, in your case, I'm imagining the challenges are probably even more acute or more particular because you're really working at that intersection of the natural sciences and the humanities. And I know or imagine that Canada's granting agencies, I believe, are set up really along, engineering, natural sciences, the humanities. So how do you and your colleagues navigate that world where you're really kind of sitting at that nexus or intersection of various disciplines?
Yeah, I mean, that has traditionally been a challenge and remains to be somewhat of a challenge. I mean, there are 3 funding agencies in Canada. And one is for health, and one is for social science, and then the third is for natural science and engineering, as Audrey just spoke about. And so typically you need to have, if you're applying to fund a project or a research program, the focus has to be squarely within one of those. You can dabble a little bit outside into something else, but if you're really working at the intersection, the interface between 2 of them, that interface itself can't be the focus of that proposal, right? And so typically I for work that I've requested funding around evaluating policies, then I would apply to the natural or to the Social Science and Humanities Research Council for work that is more on understanding the landscape configuration and how people use resources from the landscape that might come from natural science and engineering. So for me, I've diversified a little bit, but I have to frame a project around a particular, around the particular home. Now it is changing. Just this past year, Canada's granting agencies have started a new program that actually is integrative across the disciplines, and you're allowed to ask those integrative questions. But as Audrey mentioned, part of the challenge now is actually building the right teams to have those interdisciplinary research projects actually be successful. And MSSI has been great in sort of setting things up so that we have a chance of developing really strong teams to do this. But still, those interdisciplinary streams they still play a little bit of second fiddle to the main funding agencies. So, but I'm very encouraged to see those kinds of opportunities opening up, and hopefully they'll remain that way in the future.
Great. So one last question on this issue of funding. I'll go back to you, Professor Moores, if that's all right for this one. You referenced earlier the idea that, to really be successful and make an impact in the world and with sustainability is to be able to take your great and innovative ideas from your laboratories and figure out a way to commercialize them and bring them up to scale. And you were telling me that when we spoke earlier that this sometimes feels like crossing the valley of death. So maybe you can expand a little bit on that. And what are some of the challenges in terms of, getting people to believe or understand that this really is the next big idea, and of obviously putting their funding behind you to make that happen?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Derek. And this idea of the valley of death is one that is has been very popular in the management world, with this concept that from the idea that you have at the beginning, you can raise money, but until the point when this idea starts to be commercially viable and you get the really big bucks to fund your idea, there's this moment in between where it's hard, where you're too big to get the small fund and too small to actually convince people already. And crossing, being able to bridge that gap is really the difficult part. So certainly for us, being able to reach out, find the right partners, and start to play with those people and get the money necessary to continue the research while having more a foot in the application is a big challenge. And there is some funding dedicated to that, but it is often from the perspective of companies. So the government has been very gracious in giving money to, if a company comes to you and says, I want to do this, develop the R&D for me, then that's well suited. But if you have a good idea, a game changer thing that you think is going to be really valuable, and you're trying to convince companies that this is good for them, then it is not necessarily as suited for that, and it requires you to do a lot more work. Something else that also I want to add here is that I think a notion that is really important to a lot of the things that we're talking about is the notion of timeline. So in research, we have a certain timeline of what we do in our group. So we know how long a PhD lasts, a project lasts, and we can actually control that very well. But then we have to overlay over this the timeline of funding, the timeline, and then if you want to have an impact, you want to overlay timeline of research discovery and commercialization, which is completely different. They function in a different way. It's a little bit the same thing as what Brian was describing when he went to China and he had to learn all these things about how people work. I mean, to me, talking to people in business, it gives me the exact same feeling. Like I have to have somebody decode things for me sometimes because I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I'm right. So I think that this is definitely a huge challenge, but one that is critical, because if we're inventing a lot of cool stuff but it never gets out, then what's the point really? Because again, sustainability research is about helping humanity be more sustainable. So it has to have an application. Otherwise, why we're doing all that, right?
Great. And I saw Professor Robinson nodding along to most of that. So I imagine you're both feeling that. I do want to just talk for a moment about the role of attracting students to the field of sustainability. And I know that, we see hundreds of thousands of young people marching in the streets, demanding action on climate change and other environmental issues. It seems to be the big cause célèbre among young people today, and that's great. I guess my question to both of you is, do any of these students then wind up in your classrooms wanting to study this as a career? Professor Robinson, you want to jump first on that one?
Yeah, very much so. So it's partly, so I teach in a program called Sustainability, Science and Society. It's an undergraduate program that's actually unique in Canada and the world as well. It's a joint program between the Faculty of Arts and the Faculty of Science. So students in this undergraduate program are actually being trained in sort of this interdisciplinary way, starting from the undergraduate level, which is a challenge because we want to give them real skills, but also learning how to think flexibly about perspectives on the world and develop that ability to speak across disciplines. It's good to start that early. So that's what this program does. I used to direct this program, and and just in the 3 years that I was directing the program, our student population in that program doubled, and so there's huge appetite among students for really trying to get the answers, right? They know there are these big problems. They see injustices, and they see all the issues that are on the forefront of the news, and they think, well, I'm going to go to university and I'm going to learn how to fix all of these problems. And so it's no problem getting them in these things, and getting them skills to address how to tackle some of these problems. But the hard part is that for a lot of these big picture questions, we don't have simple answers, right? It's complex. And so there's also frustration among them. And I think that's why you see so many of the so much of the action that's being taken right now among the youth is political, right? They're marching, they're going out and trying to use their voice because they understand that a lot of the issues are political, and it's decision making, and these things are hard to tackle, and are things that you don't always learn in the classroom either. There are certainly classroom things that are important and useful and necessary to know to develop the solutions, but to really affect change, you do have to get out there.
Great. And Professor Moores, are you noticing the same sort of increase in appetite among young people wanting to study environmental and sustainability issues as a as an area of study and then ultimately a career?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's as Brian said, there's huge appetite for these topics, and I think that this is also coming at a time when we have attrition of subscription to the hard science, the classic science as well. So we see fewer students there, and being able to offer courses such as the green chemistry courses that we've had in McGill for many, many years. I think we were the first in the world to have a green chemistry class at the undergrad level back in the late 90s. So these are classrooms that are attracting people to understand a specific science like chemistry, but in the context of sustainability, and how can it contribute its share of developing solutions. I agree completely with what Brian said, and I think what sometimes is difficult for the youth to understand is that you really need to develop a very strong skill during your studies in order to be able later down the road affect change. It's exactly true. We don't have the solution. We need to develop it, and in order to develop it, we need skills, a skilled next generation that is gonna have expertise in geography, in biology, in chemistry, in also political activism, obviously as well. But we really need to develop all of these skills so that they can actually develop solutions. And I think this is something that they definitely get when we get to the end of their program. That there are these moments during it where they're like, why should I care about learning these old stuff when what I want to do is it. And I think it's because if you want to make change, you need to be very, very good at what you're doing. And I think it goes through studying, absolutely.
Great, great. All right, thank you both for those answers. I do have a few more questions, but maybe we could turn to some of the questions that were submitted to us by our alumni now, and then if we have time, we'll come back to a couple more on my end. Just a reminder, if you do have a question and are watching live, you can email it to us at aoc@mcgill.ca, and we'll try to squeeze it in. This first one, I guess I'll turn to you, Professor Moores, because it's about plastics. It came to us from Miriam Cohen. She writes that she finds it puzzling and possibly damaging that in an era when we are supposed to reduce the use of plastic, there are many stores using even heavier plastic bags. Is this a new kind of plastic?
So it can be, but it's often the same plastic, but that is processed differently to be thicker. And the rationale behind this is to reuse it. So one issue with the very thin plastics is that plastic bags is that it's hard to reuse because they tend to break and to not be really amenable to reuse. So by having thicker ones, we want to encourage people to recycle them and reuse them again and again. The issue, though, is that people have realized that in places where they have implemented those, they end up seeing them used as single-use plastic the same way as before, and it's resulting now in more waste because you have thicker plastic, so you have more plastic per bag. I think that the big question here, and again, it comes back to everything we discussed today, is that we need to develop these solutions. So this new plastic bag, in conjunction with a very good understanding of the psychology of the people, and put together programs where it makes sense to do this change, because behind the scene, we know that we're doing what's right so that people use and need less plastic bag per annum, for instance. So again, if you implement a thicker plastic but do nothing else, then you're going to have more pollution. But if you implement a thicker plastic and then have a program, for instance, by not giving the plastic but making people pay for the next bag, then you incentivize the reuse, and then you have a chance of having something more effective. So I think what it underlines is this idea that it's complex, and the answer is not just a technological answer. It's a technological answer aligned with real programs that are understanding how people think and live.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Well, that explains it. I had some of the same questions myself, and thank you, Miriam, for sending that question in to us. So we received two questions while we were on air, both from the same gentleman, Benjamin Bratt. Maybe he's the actor. maybe not. One for each of you. So maybe I'll start with the one to you, Professor Robinson. I'll read what's come in. He said that you are talking about stock management approaches, which are characterized by immediate effects as well as inflexible walls. For example, if you pick all the mushrooms, there are no more mushrooms. Do you also study the limit management of problems that do not show effects immediately, but instead entail negative outcomes in a more distant future, like maybe natural habitat management of some species the population relies upon?
So one of the reasons I'll give a specific answer to one of the points that was brought up, and um, when we're doing this kind of work, and especially when we're doing it on the social science side, looking at management and institutions that people develop around management. Um, it can be, I mean, we think about this in very similar ways that a natural scientist would think about trying to study a phenomenon. So we want to isolate the thing that we're trying to study, right? So, for example, and this can be really, really difficult in empirical settings. But for example, the mushroom case, one of the reasons that I was looking at mushrooms is because there's not really mushrooms are really difficult to over harvest, at least many of them are, and the one in particular that I was studying, it is. You can pick as many mushrooms that are in the forest, but they'll always come back. It's the organism of the mushroom is mycelia that are that are kind of, it's kind of like a network of nodes and fibers that are in the soil, that almost create something that's analogous to a tree. And then when you pick that mushroom, that would be analogous to picking an apple from that tree. So no matter how many apples you pick, you're not going to destroy the tree itself. And that's kind of similar to the mushroom. So taking that particular organism, you sort of remove the effect of the harvest itself. And you can isolate the idea around, well, how and why are people developing an institution that would have immediate short-term effects, and one where we don't have to actually worry about sort of these long-term cycles of over harvest and depletion that you do have to worry about with fisheries. And so that was one of the simplifying aspects of the mushroom case study, that actually helped with some of the methods that we used to try to develop, to understand how they designed and developed institutions. In general, though, these sort of stock questions are big, and you really need to understand the dynamics of the resource itself to understand anything about how to manage it sustainably, and that's where pairing with other disciplines becomes really important. I can talk in very general terms about mushroom population structure and sort of generational dynamics, but I am definitely not a mycologist, and I could never translate my knowledge of matsutake mushrooms, which is this particular mushroom that I studied, to almost any other mushroom that exists. So pairing with people who really know what they're talking about on this is crucial. But yes, I mean, the stock issues and the population dynamics for any kind of renewable resource are critical to understand to develop management plans.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I can certainly vouch for that, because I've got mushrooms growing in my front lawn all summer, and I keep pulling and pulling and pulling them out, and they just keep coming back. So I guess discouraging from a lawn care maintenance perspective as well. But so let me. So the next question, also from Mr. Bratt, was directed at Professor Moores. I should preface this that he wanted to clarify, I guess, before I ask the question, this is not to be perceived as an attack on your research, but just a question about your approach. With that, he writes, using other resources to make plastic, wouldn't the rebound effect just integrate those new materials as a supplementary source of goods? What is the approach to make new material development truly sustainable and not just a consumption feeder?
It's an excellent point, and I think this is core to a lot of the things that green chemistry is trying to develop. So the idea behind this is that what you want to do is you want to use something that is a waste and that is causing an environmental damage as it stands right now. So it's considered that there is 6 to 8 million tons of crustacea shells are discarded on a yearly basis. And we really do not have a very good plan as to what to do with them. People originally were just throwing them on the fields, and they were kind of degrading, causing some environmental damage. And it's been, in Canada, it's no longer possible to do that, actually. And now people are trying to have ways in which they can do some small transformation of the shell so that they would make fertilizers, for instance. But they're not necessarily going to help fix the entire problem and handle the entirety of the waste. So Canada is a place where you make a lot. Well, we harvest a lot of crustaceans. We're generating a lot of these wastes. So it is a resource that we should tap onto in order to make things that are important to us. I mean, in order of magnitude, this amount of shell waste that is produced globally is about the same order of magnitude as the amount of plastics released to the environment. So of course, it's hard to draw a direct comparison because it's not like you want necessarily to use crustaceans based plastics for anything that we use plastics for, but it still gives you a good idea that we do have an interesting volume here that we could tap onto to do stuff. Mm-hmm. I mean, another thing I can tell you is that there's been lots of development of biofuels, so making fuels from biomass. And when I was using sugar or corn that are competing with food, it's caused all sorts of problems. Overproduction of these crops, and then competition with food, which leads to food price increase, which has all sorts of repercussions that are undesirable. If now you can develop a process, which a bunch of people have done, where you grow or you use the waste of forestry in order to make fuels, now you move away from these damaging effects. So I think these are the things that we're trying to do, but it's essential to partner again with scientists that are experts of forestry management, agriculture, and so on and so forth, so that we can really do something that makes sense and not again create another problem trying to solve the original one.
Right. And I guess the example you just cited on biofuels is really a good example of why this multidisciplinary approach is so critical, because if we just let the scientists run rampant and do what they want without consulting with the economists and the policymakers and the international development specialists, we may end up solving one problem and creating other ones. So that's a good example. So I do want to ask each of you, in the time we have left, a little bit about the role that society, or let's call it broad public support, plays in sustainability research. I mean, it seems that we've turned a corner and have reached a point where most people have at least a general understanding that this is important stuff, that the work that you and your colleagues are involved in is critical to the very survival of our planet. And yet there are still many cynics out there, including some who hold very influential positions of leadership, who question the urgency of issues such as climate change or the budgetary costs that this might entail, and remain cynical of your efforts. So maybe I'll ask you, Professor Moores, how do you handle these cynics?
It's
with a sigh.
Yeah, no, it's difficult, and at the same time, we have to take this extremely seriously. I mean, we live in a world where, because of the speed with which information is exchanged, because of the facility with which information is exchanged, we can create webcasts now practically out of the blue and exchange phenomenal ideas together. But you can also do the same thing when not being an expert of anything and start spreading ideas in all sorts of directions. And I think this is a very important thing we should look into, because science and facts are not an opinion; they are science and facts. But what's important for people to understand as well is that as we are producing science, we do not have all the answers to all the questions right away. The way we understand a problem is evolving, and this is normal. This is science. Science is about making experiments, collecting data, trying to interpret this, project them against a model, and then go back to the bench and produce more data to challenge it. And I think that this idea that, one day we could say something and the next say something slightly different because we figured that it was not exactly how we thought it was originally, is actually a power of science. This is how we've built the knowledge that we have right now. But it is extremely difficult to convey that message to people who are only used to hearing plot theory and opinions and religions, and because this kind of communication delivery is it looks the same, but it be deep down, science is not built the same way. And I think that we need to develop literacy along those ideas. And it's difficult. This is messy. It's a complex system, but we have to try. And hopefully, us talking to people as much as possible. We have a responsibility. We hold grants from taxpayers' money, and we hold the responsibility to talk to the public and explain those ideas as much as possible. And I'm very excited today to be contributing to that, in particular with you, Derek and Brian. But this is it's the only way we can handle the skeptics. I mean, I don't know any other.
Great. Well, thank you for that answer. And I think what Professor Moores is saying is when this recording is over, share this link with all of your friends and family so everybody can watch this. Professor Robinson, so what role do you feel that academics need to play to ensure that these conversations remain top of mind and that we as society continue to apply pressure on our politicians and our policy leaders to invest the necessary funding and time and energy to the cause of sustainability?
Well, first and foremost, I think we need to do good science. And this is what a bit of what Audrey is saying too, is that the science is the science. We're not trying to push political agendas. I think if the outcome of our science has political impact, then that should be listened to and be part of that conversation. But the basis of this is really just doing good and unbiased work. And everybody that I work with and I know are that's our goal and objective, right? I mean, the other really important part of this is trying to make sure that that there are pathways that help direct our science to ask important and societally relevant questions, right? So having those mechanisms where the things that are of important policy that are of policy importance that require sort of the cutting edge of research fields, making sure that that dialogue is happening between the policymakers and the scientists to make sure the right questions are getting asked. I mean, in some ways, that only gets translated to us through grant directives. There's a big research grant in this topic area, and so then people will devise research projects all on that topic area. And so that's one way of doing it, but that's not a very it's not a two-way discussion. It's an agenda that's set in one place. And so having better dialogue between policymakers and sort of how to set research agendas, I think, would help in this way too. It shouldn't be all of what science does, or even social science, but I think having space for researchers to engage in those huge policy questions that are of paramount importance is one way to make sure that we stay relevant and they get answers that they need as well.
Great. Thank you for that, for both of you, for those answers. So just to clarify, we did just get another note from Benjamin Bratt, who thanks you both for your answers and says that he is not the actor. Well, thank you, Mr. Bratt, for that follow-up. So we only have a couple of minutes left. Maybe I'll just throw one more question out to each of you and maybe ask you if you could respond in 30 seconds. And that's this. If I brought each of you back here 20 years from now in a similar kind of format, do you think that we will be discussing the same sustainability challenges, the same environmental challenges as we are today, or will the world have moved on to having solved many of these issues? Professor Moores, you want to start with that one?
Wow, that is a question.
You weren't expecting it, eh?
I think that I hope that we're going to have different problems. I'm pretty sure we're going to have problems still, which are going to have some similarities with the problems that we're talking about now, meaning things where you have complex systems, lots of interactions between very different partners, and again, problems that will require interdisciplinary solutions. So I'm pretty sure that we're going to be faced with that kind of problems for a while, but I hope that some of the problems that we're talking about today will be solved. But it's going to be new one emerging potentially from some of the solutions that we found today. So we'll try our best to not have unintended consequences. It's a big thing in sustainability research, unintended consequences, but I think that it may happen just from the growth of humanity and so on. And I would be surprised that we don't have to deal with problems where, again, systems thinking, interdisciplinary research is not the answer, some part of the answer.
Okay, great, thank you. And Professor Robinson, is 20 years enough of a time frame to solve many of these issues?
Yeah, I think in 20 years, I think we'll have made progress on some fronts, and I feel like, I mean, I'm an optimist at heart. I don't think you can't work on these kinds of issues and not sort of have a fundamentally optimistic output, or you can't work on them for very long anyway. And so I'm optimistic. I do feel like there is momentum and change that is happening on lots of really interesting societal dimensions right now, and I think there's momentum for changing climate policy that hopefully will grab hold sometime in the next 20 years. I don't think we're going to be all the way there yet. I think there's still going to be more to do, and I think, as Audrey said, the nature of problems and how we tackle them, I think those kinds of issues are going to still be quite relevant. These problems of interdisciplinarity and talking amongst one another, and how to get one sector to work with another sector. I think these things are going to be with us to stay for a long time, and I think we need maybe to develop agents that just work at the interface between some of these things. But yeah, I mean, I'm optimistic, but there's going to be more to do. Realistic enough to know that it's not going to be a new utopia in 20 years.
Right. Well, hopefully we'll both have the two of you still at McGill chugging away as part of the university and part of the McGill Sustainability Systems Initiative in 2 decades from now and beyond, helping us get to some of these answers. So thank you both. That does about wrap up the time we have for today. Before we close, I would like to remind you that this video will be available at this very same link soon after our recording ends. So feel free to follow Professor Moore's lead and share it with others who may not have been able to tune in live. If you are a McGill graduate who is not currently receiving our emails but would like to be added to our distribution list, you can visit alumni.mcgill.ca/register to sign up. This link will also be available beneath the video player on our YouTube channel. I would, of course, like to extend my deep gratitude to our two guests, Professors Audrey Moores and Brian Robinson, for joining me today and for shedding some incredibly interesting insight into both their work as well as some of the broader challenges that they and their colleagues are each facing. Our conversation around sustainability in partnership with the McGill Sustainability Systems Initiative will continue in 2 weeks' time on Thursday, October 15th, when I will be joined by researchers from the areas of biology, engineering, and international development to talk about their successes in translating research and knowledge into real-world change, which feels like the perfect note on which to conclude our 4-part series on sustainability. I do hope to see many of you back here for that. Until then, please stay safe and be well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Derek.
Born from a will, made here by dreamers and risk takers, by makers and big thinkers. Through trial and error, we face what's ahead, staying true to the voice that never fails us. Keep learning. We were made for this. Made by lamplight and late nights, by salut and goodbyes, by questioning everything and feeding our curiosity, by testing our resilience, by finding our limits. By by pushing forward and by breaking through, by finding a new way, our own way. We're made where ideas are built and built upon, where we come together and we rise above. We are made by McGill.